A new Western Conference contender has emerged as a potential trade partner for the Brooklyn Nets and one Kevin Durant. We're going to break that down, but also discuss the league wide perspective that's finally starting to acknowledge it may take a lot to land the superstar talent that is Kevin Durant. We break it down next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack, and not yonder there next to me is one Doug Norrie, owner-operator of DFSR for all your daily fantasy sports ranking needs. He's got you covered from DraftKings to FanDuel. That's your boy. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms, and you, the listener, the viewer. Let's dive in on, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because, listen, obviously, if you were following the podcast, as I know you were all last week, Doug did some good crossover, great crossover. How dare I say good, great crossover content with Matt Brooks, just talking about Kevin Durant, about Kyrie Irving, about the state of things, Joe Tsai, Sean Marks, obviously Steve Nash, and just everything that's gone on. And there's other things that we want to get to, and we will this week, including having some of the trade exemptions expire, maybe wasting that money. Why has that happened? Is Sean Marks responsible? There's still so many variables that we have to go through here while we push towards a month away training camp and trying to figure out what is this team, right? With the superstars intact and without them, there's still going to be a lot of things that we can take a look at there. However, Shams Charania came out with an article for The Athletic starting to highlight a new contender potentially in the Kevin Durant sweepstakes in the Memphis Grizzlies. His name's been bandied about. Like, people have talked about wanting the Memphis Grizzlies to be a part of this discussion, pairing Kevin Durant with John Morant. Ooh, Durant and Morant. I mean, how could you not? It's almost like we got to get this deal done now. But there's a bit of a shift here too in terms of what maybe the Nets desire versus what other teams want to, are willing to, or have the ability to give up. So we're going to walk through a couple of these scenarios before we get to the Memphis Grizzlies. Just some context for you, as it were. We know, of course, as Shams Charania reports in this article, it's been a couple of weeks since Kevin Durant met with Joe Tsai and reiterated, I want to be traded. He labels it as a request. I think we can say / demand, and he's fully within his rights. We understand that. Among those teams, obviously, the Boston Celtics, the Toronto Raptors, and the Miami Heat remain among the most serious threats to land Kevin Durant because they have the types of pieces necessary, Charania mentions in his article. And we know that. Now, one of the things that we talked about where the offer from the Boston Celtics stood speculatively, as in, okay, GMs are going to talk, and yeah, if, then would be, might want to, gonna require. But he does frame it as officially offered. He doesn't say the Celtics officially offered. The verbatim is, the Celtics offered all-star Jaylen Brown, guard Derek White, and a first-round pick in July, according to league sources, which obviously did not get any traction with the Nets. We know the speculation around wanting a Marcus Smart, wanting a Grant or Robert Williams, wanting more capital, draft capital to go along with it. The interesting thing that I just want to footnote about this as we move through some of these is just a reminder that Jaylen Brown in his own right, if the Celtics were to trade him to team X in the league, is worth what? 2, 3 first-round picks probably. And we know he has a couple years left on his contract, etc. But what is his market value from a pure draft capital standpoint? That's the part from a net side of it that needs to be factored in here, right? When we're talking about the players and the draft capital, well, as we've always said, you can't just use one random model in Rudy Gobert and say it was 6 first-round picks. Okay, go look at the talent from a player standpoint that was included. We won't belabor that. The Toronto Raptors, as we know, refused to make Rookie of the Year Scotty Barnes available. Though, to contextualize that a little bit further, some executives around the league, sources say, have looked at Toronto and said, yeah, you make Scotty Barnes available. We know that he's the rookie of the year, but Kevin Durant's talent is his talent. And by the way, in that specific instance, if we're talking about Scotty Barnes being like that is the apple of the Nets' eye when it comes to that particular trade partner, well, how much less would the ask be for other players on Toronto or draft capital coming back, right? That I think is an interesting one that we talked about early days and can still come back to and say, well, you really don't want to give up Scotty Barnes. And let's compare it just to the Celtics here briefly. When the Nets say, we want Jaylen Brown, well, we're offering you Jaylen Brown, says the Celtics, right? But we also want draft capital. We also want Marcus Smart. Marcus Smart's not the best player in that scenario. Scotty Barnes would be projecting to what he can be potentially the best player in that package. Now, straight up, best player available in this immediate moment would be Pascal Siakam. But the bottom line being, you're getting what you would consider to be your most desired player in that deal. Likewise with the Celtics, the most desired is Jaylen Brown. So how would that flesh out from a Toronto Raptors standpoint? Could you get another player in there like a Trent Jr. and then some picks potentially, etc.? The big issue there, as we've always known, it's the money because Scotty Barnes isn't making a lot. OG making north of 17, 35 for a guy like Siakam. Trent Jr. also on that north of $17 million contract. Making the money work matters. That being the case, the other big candidate mentioned still being in the hunt, as according to Shams Charania, is the Miami Heat. But this is where you run into it because the Miami Heat have refused to include Bam Adebayo in these discussions, which obviously the Nets would want. But big factor there being, even if the Nets wanted Bam Adebayo, they now have to figure out what to do with Ben Simmons. And currently, his value is as such that you'd be really hard pressed to say, well, we want Bam Adebayo, and in order to get him, we're going to kick Ben Simmons for pennies on the dollar to team X so that we can get Bam Adebayo, but we're not getting back the right value. And now what we've effectively done, even though we know Ben Simmons is not Kevin Durant, is not near his level, and everything is based on health, etc. Now we're just taking away another potential player from our team. Obviously, inside of all of these discussions, we know, at least we theoretically know, the caveat is if Kevin Durant goes, then Kyrie Irving could go, then maybe Ben Simmons could go too. These all can be cascading effects here, depending on what happens in one scenario. But the Miami Heat being into it is cool. It seems like it's going to be a lot, and we're going to get to what another factor of that might look like. Went on here, we'll talk about in a second, a handful of other teams, the most recently mentioned Philadelphia 76ers, and then one that I threw out a little talk over on the old internet machine there over on Twitter a couple of days ago. All of a sudden gets a little bit of validation here as we look at a handful of other teams that Shams Charania is confirming, expressed, showed interest, and even put together packages for the Brooklyn Nets to consider. All of these things, as we'll outline here in a moment, continue to build this momentum around. It's not about that the Nets and Kevin Durant can't find trade partners. It's about where the Nets are in this process. And if you rewind the clock, we consistently said that the Nets don't have any pressure to make a move here in the immediacy. We're getting closer to a potential sit out in training camp for Kevin Durant. Things are getting more contentious. But in terms of, and this, we can include Kevin Durant in this, getting him where he wants to go and the Nets getting back what they feel like is the right package, the right value, the timetable can continue to get a little bit longer here. We'll dive into more of that next. But first, over here on the right-hand side, my friends, we've got to tell you about a little situation. Now, you know that if you keep saying that you need to make a budget, but you never do, you never do. I talk about it all the time. Watch this budget I'm about to make. It never happens. Somehow you keep missing credit card payments. Good Lord, you know you can't do it. You know what credit has? Interest. That's a problem for you. And if you're afraid to look at your bank statements, then it's time that you take control back on your financial life. Meet Rocket Money, formerly Truebill. You've heard us talk about them, our favorite financial app. So why did Truebill change its name over to Rocket Money? Well, let me tell you what I've heard. Truebill, now backed by Rocket Companies, has grown from a bill management app into a full-on personal financial empowerment tool that helps over 3.4 million people with budgeting, lowering bills, canceling subscriptions, and so much more saving each of their members on average $700 a year. And with all that growth comes the next evolution of Truebill's story, a new name. Bottom line, Rocket Money is everything I have loved about Truebill with a fresh new look and feel. I told you how much I like Truebill, getting rid of those duplicate subscriptions, saving me money. They're still doing all those great things for you, and now so much more. You can start canceling your unused subscriptions and save money at rocketmoney.com/LockedOnNBA. That's rocketmoney.com/LockedOnNBA, or download the app from the Apple Store or from Google Play as well. All right, my friends. Let's talk about a couple of these other ones here on the table. Again, friendly reminder, we're going to come back in. We're going to talk about TPEs. We're going to talk about wasted money. We're going to talk about viable options to continue to fill out this roster. A lot of discussion over on social media, and I'm certainly from Nets fans in general, saying, hey, where are the moves? And this is not going to help Sean Marks' reputation if you're in the ire of a certain segment, a large segment of the Nets fan base. But you are a little bit hamstrung here because making moves like when they went out and gave a first round pickup for Royce O'Neal only to have Kevin Durant request a trade, well, now you're going to get hit from in the public eye for giving up that capital to go get a player that only makes sense if you have the superstars. And in the absence of those superstars, suddenly Royce O'Neal is a nice, albeit player filler that you would not, I think, have gone out and acquired, especially for a first round pick, if you knew what was coming down the pike. That being the case, Shams Charania article. Philadelphia 76ers expressed an interest in Durant, but here was a couple ones that I thought were fun when we talk about going back to June into July. Milwaukee Bucks and the Denver Nuggets also inquired. So think about when we say teams, everybody was in the mix and in the market. Not only were teams in the mix of the market, but some teams were making legitimate offers to the Brooklyn Nets. We talk about the New Orleans Pelicans, who we talked about certainly being in the conversation, or places that we thought, hey, they got some assets there. Reported on June 30th, were willing to engage in those discussions. However, they deemed All-Star Brandon Ingram as untouchable, sources said. And then in this past month, we also had the Atlanta Hawks. This is what I said over on Twitter. I put together the package. Now, before I tell you what the offer was, my package surrounded around a trade that would involve John Collins, who I've talked about before. I think the Nets should go out and acquire him. He's a good piece to move forward with beyond this iteration of the superstar roster that you have there, combined with a Bogdan Bogdanovic. I also looked at some combination of maybe Jalen Johnson, maybe AJ Griffin, the rookie, and a couple of picks. Not getting too deep in the picks because you're talking about a lot of players. People said, hey, but you got to have Hunter be involved in that. That's fine. The money mechanics there get a little tricky, where you would need it to be not only John Collins, but also Jalen Johnson, also Hunter, also Griffin, and then picks, etc., whatever it's going to look like. The Atlanta Hawks reached out and they said, how about John Collins, DeAndre Hunter, and a draft pick for Kevin Durant? The sticking point that we keep coming back to is the draft capital. And that's where I think it's kind of fascinating, because we keep hearing and everyone keeps saying, here's a package opportunity, right? Like I talked about the Atlanta Hawks. I think maybe I said 3 first-round picks, and maybe you settle on 2. But if you're saying that John Collins and DeAndre Hunter, and everyone that I threw that out to, all came back with Hunter has to be involved in it. And I said, okay, it's going to involve a little more mechanics here. But if you think about a player like AJ Griffin, what is he? Taken 16th overall in the NBA draft. That's a first round value there. So there's a first round pick. If you think that Hunter has first round value potentially when you get him back, that's another, right? And to whatever degree you want to apply that. And then what is John Collins? Mentioned it about Jaylen Brown. If the Atlanta Hawks went outright and traded him to Team X, what would he get back? 2 first-round picks? Maybe more, right? So now all of a sudden, when you look at a package like this, you're effectively representing 3 or 4 first-round picks to go along with these players. That is what the capital is valued at here. So in that scenario, I'm not saying that I automatically jump at that apple, but I don't think we're as far away as maybe we feel like recently, when Sean Marks and the Nets said, hey, we have the ask, right? When we think about deals like the LA Lakers saying, hey, they're coming back to the table, they want to give a second first-round pick. It actually kind of contextualizes it a little bit more, because if you think about the LA Lakers, who said, we'll give you a first-round pick and an expiring $47 million Russell Westbrook contract for Kyrie Irving. Why are they coming back now and saying, you know what? We'll give you another first round pick for Kyrie Irving and this expiring Russell Westbrook contract, something that the Nets have vehemently pushed back on. Sean Marks, almost couldn't get that word out of my mouth there. Because the 47, not only is the $47 million, listen, it's 1 year, you could live with that, but they don't want Russell Westbrook. They're flat out refusing it. But you come back to the table with another first round pick. So when you're thinking about that package, talking about Kyrie Irving, you are looking at it and saying, yeah, the value of the player coming in and where we think he is in the last year of his deal, maybe definitely coming or not necessarily coming back to the Brooklyn Nets, not open to returning to the team beyond this year. The LA Lakers can't afford to wait the extra year because everyone, mostly LeBron James, is going to be getting older. These factors matter, right? So we're looking to get this deal done. We're also looking to get rid of Russell Westbrook's $47 million, and not a lot of teams can afford to eat that dollar amount coming into the year. So likewise, when we talk about Kevin Durant and all of these trade iterations, I think what we're doing right now is getting this sense of, hey, we're navigating, we're moving the goalpost around what is the draft capital value you apply to a Jaylen Brown, to a Derek White, to a John Collins, to a DeAndre Hunter, right? All of these guys are getting compartmentalized in there. And then you're saying plus draft capital. And really, in the two most viable, at least to this point, if we're going to include Atlanta in it, I will just say it is fascinating to me that I understand, say the Pelicans saying, listen, just Ingram is flat out not on the table. Now you can go back and revisit that one and talk about the other pieces there and the draft capital and whether or not you could get there. You'd be talking about projecting the value of a player, projecting what the ceiling could be. Whereas in the case of the Boston Celtics with Jaylen Brown, and in the case of even the Atlanta Hawks and John Collins to different degrees, but you feel like you know what both those players are, and you know that there still is probably more of a ceiling beyond where they currently stand. But that's a definitive, right? You feel like you have that. Variable here too. John Collins under contract for 4 more years at a pretty reasonable number. So you have to like having the control of a player like that if the Nets like him in the long term. The factor we've talked about before when it comes to Boston, Jaylen Brown, 2 years left on his deal. Well, the Brooklyn Nets could make that trade, play Jaylen Brown for a season, and then go into next offseason and say, who wants the services of Jaylen Brown for 2 or 3 more draft picks? In all of these discussions, this is what I think is going on behind the scenes for the Brooklyn Nets. It's not about, in my opinion, whether or not because it just feels broken to me. And you can go look at a great discussion from Matt Brooks, along obviously Doug Norrie, co-host, hosting that discussion. Fantastic conversation. For me personally, this still right now is not about can we fight through this and come out the other side with Kevin Durant intact. I just think it's about massaging these scenarios and saying, what are we getting back? And not only are they viable for us right now in the short term, but are they viable for us beyond this year? Does their value extend beyond just trading them and looking at them as the pieces we move forward with? Likewise with a Ben Simmons, low value right now, a year from now, still under contract, could be even more valuable on the market. And we can continue to restack our draft capital and build ourselves towards what is not the sexiest or the most attractive decision, but build towards the inevitable future of needing to rebuild this franchise. That's what seems to be a big factor in these discussions. So I find it fascinating. I know that nobody wants to, hear me say or hear anyone say you should trade Kevin Durant. And I understand inherently getting the value for Kevin Durant is not the easiest thing in the world to do. But the cap off of this discussion is I think the Nets are just analyzing it and saying, what is John Collins' value? What could his value be a year from now? How many picks are they giving us? And what does that feel like moving forward? If 2 years from now, the Brooklyn Nets are able to look back and say, we got 6 first-round picks through different components of that process, a couple of draft picks now, a player who turns into a couple of draft picks later. I think that that's all in the discussion. And still inside of all that work, finding a way to make sure that you get new cornerstone pieces. They can be acquired in the draft And you can look at the stopgap scenario of we get good players back, we stay competitive. Maybe one of them can be a centerpiece. If he's not the centerpiece, though, we go to the draft, we take a shot on a talent, and if they develop, now all of a sudden we can move that other piece. We can move that other player, and we can continue to fold over this roster and this organization in a positive direction coming out of what has been a disaster. And the last footnote is Sean Marks has made mistakes. We all know that. We agree with it. However, he was really good at this, massaging and manipulating money and moving parts and contracts and players. So if I think that there's one guy that can wheel and deal his way out of a terrible scenario and into a productive, potentially, back to hopeful fan base situation, yeah, I think Sean Marks is capable of it. Let's come back in and finally get to the piece de resistance, the conversation around the Memphis Grizzlies, Ja Morant and Durant potentially getting onto the same team. We dive in next. Brooklyn, yo. Easy money. Simple tweet from a simple man. Ja Morant tweeted out easy money. And that's all that it took, my friends, for the speculation to begin. But I will say, after this came out after The Athletic reported that Durant had requested a trade back in June, a tweet from Ja Morant caught the attention of the pro Durant move trade camp, right? And that was the easy money quote, right? So we talked about this before. And this is where, again, it comes back full circle when we're talking about these packages and the Nets saying, well, we want an elite talent, an established player like a Jaylen Brown, but we also want a secondary option. Maybe we also want draft capital. That's been kind of the footnote, the draft capital piece, right? So when we have these discussions about, I remember going back and saying, what was it? Toronto Raptors. Well, we want OG and Scotty Barnes and Trent Jr. And we also want Kem Birch, plus give me 4 first-round picks. It's too much. The draft value of those players individually plus the capital, we're talking about 10 to 12. And it's all predicated on some weird, wacky system that Doug and I have discussed around that Rudy Gobert trade. Other teams are experiencing this right now, like Utah with Donovan Mitchell, and what the ask is and what the willingness is to give up the capital from a player and draft pick standpoint. Organizations are willing to do. You can't strip them. Right. And we say this every time when it comes to Kevin Durant. No team trading for Kevin Durant is going to be willing to strip all of the talent off that roster for the dream of having Kevin Durant. Guess what? Not for nothing. Buyer beware, because the Brooklyn Nets have had Kevin Durant on their roster and have not been able to win. All kinds of mitigating factors involved in that. But they've had talent on the roster and it hasn't come to fruition. So the interesting thing about the Memphis Grizzlies, and what starts to open it up any discussion around any of these teams, is that not unlike the Phoenix Suns, as mentioned in the Shams Charania article, they were talking about the all-defensive wing, Mikal Bridges, as it's mentioned in the article. But a handful of first-round picks to get the job done. That was it. We'll give you a player. We'll give you a lot of draft capital. Likewise, the Memphis Grizzlies are not willing to include Jackson or Bane in a potential offer for Kevin Durant. So you're not going to get Jaren Jackson, the young center playing at 6'11", 242, 22 years old. You're not going to get the other value of having a guy like Desmond Bane on your roster, which is great because it's 2 years at a very low salary and just 24 years old, 6'5" shooting guard. You like everything that you're getting from those two players, and you can't touch them. What can you touch? Well, you can touch other players on the roster, certainly to make the money work, as we know, because you do have some pretty big dollar amounts on there. Jaren Jackson's making $28.9 million. Tyus Jones is making $15 million. Ja Morant, while he's on a quality contract, he's still making 12. And then you throw in some of the guys that you assume would be a part of this package. This is less about what the players are and what the trade draft capital is going to be. Steven Adams making $18 million, 1-year deal. Yeah, you're going to eat that. It's not 47 like a trade for Kyrie Irving with the LA Lakers. Dylan Brooks making $11.4 million on a 1-year deal. Again, taking in money that doesn't need to stay on your books in the near future. To go along with, I threw in some other guys just in terms of looking across the roster, young talent like Zaire Williams at just 20 years old. We want him. He's not one of the untouchables. We also want Xavier Tillman, who I enjoyed coming out of college, certainly, and seems to be developing into his own at the NBA level. But then what do you really get to give me? You get to give me the draft capital. The Memphis Grizzlies have at their disposal, if we just back this out here for a second, the Memphis Grizzlies inside of their pick stash are going to have 2023 first rounder. They also have 2 picks in 2024, their own and Golden State's. They go on and have 2025. They have 2026 and 27, 28, and 29. So there is a lot of opportunity here. When you look over the handful of players and you say, are any of them really worth the first rounder, second, where's the value chart there? But if I told you that you could put together a package that landed you the handful of players that I mentioned there, most of which don't matter, but there certainly are guys that you can still keep around. They're not Jaylen Browns. They're not Brendan Ingrams, but there could be some quality there. And four or maybe 5 first-round picks. I don't know if they could manage the 5th first-round pick. That's the other side of the coin here that we said before about if you make a trade for less draft picks, but the players you get in return can turn into additional capital, maybe there's an opportunity there. As it stands right now, it's hard for me to look at that scenario and think that the Nets or Sean Marks, or really that the league, would allow that to go down without coming to the table with a little bit more. Now, the picks saying, hey, we can give you 4 first-round picks. Maybe that entices the Boston Celtics or the Atlanta Hawks to move the needle a little bit more. I think even the Atlanta Hawks is maybe even more interesting because when you look at that package, you say, John Collins is not Jaylen Brown. So 1 first-round pick, like was offered from the Boston Celtics, why don't you go ahead and make that 2? And why don't you throw in AJ Griffin? Whatever it may look like, right? Maybe you can move the needle in that package because you're saying, hey, over here, few young talents I can get, right? Financial freedom I can get from the Memphis Grizzlies potentially. And I can also get shots to fire, right? Go into the NBA draft over the next 3, 4, 5 years, and I can take a look every single round and I can get an opportunity at a young talent that could turn into a superstar. The biggest thing that I could think would hold up a trade like this, where it's not about the players, but about the draft capital, is simply this. There's no guarantee. The draft capital does not mean anything. It's, as they say, a lottery ticket. It's a chance. And the question becomes, do the Brooklyn Nets care about being competitive potentially over the next couple of seasons and then turning players into more draft capital, or about simply getting as much capital now as possible? And in the case of the Memphis Grizzlies, and we talked about where can they get another pick from? The Golden State Warriors. Why is that a problem? Golden State Warriors are going to be good. Memphis Grizzlies with John Morant and Kevin Durant, they're going to be good. So you're going to have back-end first-round picks. That's the biggest hindrance here to a discussion like this. You want to give me picks over the next 4 or 5 years, and unlike other opportunities where short-term viability could all of a sudden become a stripped-down rebuild in a couple of years after Kevin Durant leaves, Memphis Grizzlies aren't going to go anywhere. When Kevin Durant's done in 4 years end of his contract, stays with Memphis, moves on wherever, they're still going to have John Morant. Like, Memphis isn't going away, so they're still going to be competitive. Some of this is also about projecting forward to how valuable the later draft picks can be for you. That's why in the instance of the Kyrie Irving trade in the LA Lakers, what's tantalizing about that is, what are the LA Lakers going to be by 27, 2029? Hey, you want Kyrie Irving? Great. Is LeBron James still going to be there by 2029? I don't think so, right? And knowing that if the quality of that team comes down, and if you look in the Western Conference and you think about where the other teams that are on the rise are going to be there with consistency going forward, now all of a sudden you're intrigued about that draft capital and what it could look like for you. Maybe it's a top 12, a top 10, whatever, right? Maybe you're getting into the lottery. That is where those discussions open up a little bit wider for Sean Marks. All of this to say, teams are interested. That's all. Teams are into it. And when you go and you look at a team like the Memphis Grizzlies saying, hey, we'll make the money work with players and we'll give you 4 or 5 first-round picks, however we make it work. When you hear that the Boston Celtics are saying, hey, Jaylen Brown, Derek White, first-round pick, here we go. When you hear that the Toronto Raptors aren't willing to give up Scotty Barnes yet, that the Atlanta Hawks put together a package of John Collins and Hunter and a pick. How far away are we? We're not miles away. We're talking about, hey, I want an extra player. I want an extra pick. It's a cat and mouse game. It's only going to come down to how do you get these players back to the table? And I mean the teams. How do you get these guys back to the table? How do you continue to show that, yeah, we'll go to training camp and have Kevin Durant sit out. We'll go to the regular season and have Kevin Durant sit out. None of this is about whether or not I think the Brooklyn Nets should want to keep Kevin Durant. It's just about in the inevitable future where the trade has to be made. I think the options are far more attractive and far wider reaching than we initially or when recently were being led to believe. There are a lot of teams on the table here. They're just trying to figure out where they are in the pecking order. That's all. Can I get myself into this discussion? When the Atlanta Hawks say John Collins and Hunter and a pick, and you hear Boston say Jaylen Brown, Derek White and a pick. Okay. What are you going to ante up with, Atlanta? Because I tell you what right now, pretty viable if you talk about having Trae Young and DeJounte Murray and Kevin Durant into that mix there. Yeah, that is some exciting stuff. To say nothing, we're going to do a lot of other stuff this week, but to say nothing of getting a third team involved, like we continue to discuss. And if you are the Memphis Grizzlies, if you are the Phoenix Suns, that's your only viable path. Because to tie a bow on this, the Nets are not going to be inclined to like the possibility of talent. They want the proven commodity of talent that they can do with whatever they choose over the next handful of years. That's why guys under contract work for them, and it's why established talents work for them. And it's why it's either been young, dynamic, Scotty Barnes, the future is bright, and he's so young, and he's going to be our centerpiece, or established number 2 elite talent, John Collins, Jaylen Brown, and we can flip them into something else in the next couple of years. That's why that's the driving force here. That's why it's a patient practice, let alone all the other chaos around this team. Guys, I'm going to tell you right now, we're going to come back in. We're going to talk about those wasted TPEs. We're going to talk about free agent market. We're going to talk about trying to improve this roster, regardless of which superstars are here or not, all throughout this week. Got a crossover lined up. That's going to be fun for the end of the week on Friday. Be there for that. So we're going to have some good stuff coming up this week. I am bubbling with energy after a week off from the show. Heavy lift. Saw those footsteps, right? Just one set of them. That's because I was getting carried by Doug. Now I get to return the favor. Get over to YouTube. Really good numbers last week on Doug's solo show. Let's be better. Let's outserve those numbers this week on the podcast feed, wherever you get those needs fulfilled on the YouTube channel. Get in onto the comments. It's trade talk, buddy. You knew I couldn't kick off a solo week without getting into some trade discussions. We'll break it all down. And no quote, as always, short of saying, I miss my friend. Can't wait until he's right back here alongside me so we can keep talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.